The Galactic Defense Coalition's emergency beacon pierced through the static-filled communications array aboard the starship Resilience. Admiral's four eyes narrowed as the distress signal translated across his holographic display. The message was simple, desperate, and impossible. Single human operative requests immediate evacuation. Position, station outer rim. Status, holding defensive line against assault fleet. Request acknowledged. Assistance en route. Chitinous fingers clicked against his command console in disbelief. The station had been abandoned 3 cycles ago when intelligence reported an incoming war fleet. The entire system had been evacuated. No one should have been there, especially not a single human fighting an entire enemy armada. They were not ordinary raiders. They were a species bred for conquest, standing nearly 12 feet tall with natural armor plating and weapons that could tear through standard coalition defenses like tissue paper. Their war fleets consisted of hundreds of ships, each carrying thousands of warriors. The idea that one person, regardless of species, could hold them back was beyond comprehension. "Navigation, set course for station immediately," commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen 3 decades of interstellar warfare. His tactical officer, a serpentine named, raised her head from her console. "Admiral, with respect, the system is now behind enemy lines. Intelligence suggests they have established a staging ground there. We would be flying directly into hostile territory." "One does not abandon coalition personnel, regardless of the tactical situation," replied firmly. "Besides, I am curious to see what manner of human can single-handedly delay an invasion force." The Resilience and her escort fleet of 12 ships jumped to hyperspace, racing toward what should have been certain doom. During the journey, reviewed the files on station. It had been a minor research outpost studying exotic matter, staffed by a small team of scientists and a single security officer. The security roster showed only one name: Human Defense Corps, assigned as Station Protection Specialist. As they emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, the fleet's sensors immediately detected the impossible. Station still stood, its lights blazing defiantly in the darkness of space. Around it, debris fields stretched for thousands of kilometers, the twisted remains of warships, their hulls cracked open like broken eggs. "Sensor report," demanded. "Sir, we're detecting massive damage to the fleet. At least 40 destroyed vessels, with many more showing critical damage. The station appears to be operating at minimal power but is structurally intact. We're receiving a transmission." The main screen flickered to life, revealing a human face streaked with soot and fatigue. Looked like he had been awake for days, his military uniform torn and stained. Behind him, sparks flew from damaged control panels, and the distant sound of weapons fire echoed through the station's corridors. "Admiral, this is Station Security Chief. Glad to see you made it. Things have been a bit hectic here lately." His voice carried a calmness that seemed completely at odds with the chaos visible behind him. "Chief, what is your situation? Our sensors show extensive damage to the fleet. How is this possible?" Managed a tired grin. "Well, sir, it turns out the research team here was working on some pretty interesting defensive applications of exotic matter manipulation. When the evacuation order came, someone had to stay behind to maintain the containment fields. Couldn't risk all that experimental energy falling into enemy hands." Another explosion shook the station and glanced over his shoulder. "Unfortunately, the don't seem to understand the concept of strategic withdrawal. They keep sending boarding parties, and I keep having to explain why that's a bad idea." Stared at the transmission in amazement. "You have been fighting a siege for 3 cycles, alone." "Not entirely alone, Admiral. The station's automated defense systems are quite sophisticated once you know how to reprogram them. Plus, they have a tendency to underestimate human creativity when it comes to improvised weaponry." As if to emphasize his point, another section of his uniform was singed by a nearby electrical discharge. "Chief, prepare for immediate evacuation. We will provide cover while you—" "With respect, Admiral, negative on the evacuation. I've got about 6 more hours before the exotic matter containment reaches critical mass. If I can hold the line until then, we can take out the entire staging fleet in one shot. They've been kind enough to cluster their remaining ships for a final assault." The transmission cut to static as another massive impact shook station, leaving the coalition fleet staring at empty space and wondering how a single human had turned an impossible situation into an opportunity for victory. Admiral watched in fascination as sensor readings from station showed impossible energy signatures. Whatever had done to the research facility's systems' conventional understanding of defensive capabilities. The human had essentially turned a science station into a fortress that had held off an entire invasion fleet for 3 days. "Admiral, we're detecting massive fleet movement," reported Commander from her tactical station. "It appears they're consolidating all remaining forces for a final assault on the station. We count 137 ships moving into attack formation." Through the communications static, his voice crackled back to life. "Admiral, you might want to pull your ships back to a safe distance. Things are about to get interesting down here." "Chief, you cannot possibly hold against that many ships. Allow us to extract you immediately." "Negative, sir. I've spent 3 days setting this up, and I'm not about to waste the opportunity. Besides, someone needs to explain to these why attacking a human research station was a tactical error." On the main display, the Coalition fleet could see the massive armada approaching station like a closing fist. Each ship bristled with weapons capable of reducing planets to rubble. The lead vessels began firing, their energy beams creating brilliant flashes against the station's hastily reinforced shields. But something was wrong. The closer the ships got to the station, the more their formations began to falter. Ships that should have been maintaining perfect attack vectors started drifting, their engines flickering and failing. "What am I seeing here?" demanded. His science officer, a crystalline being named, studied the readings with growing excitement. "Admiral, the human has weaponized the exotic matter research. He's created a localized gravitational distortion field around the station. The closer enemy ships approach, the more their navigation and propulsion systems are affected by spatial temporal fluctuations." "In simple terms, please." "He's turned space itself into a weapon." On the station was moving through corridors that looked more like a war zone than a research facility. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on walls by energy weapon impacts. They had managed to breach the outer hull in several places, but their boarding parties found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. A human defending his ground with nothing to lose and unlimited creativity. The first group of warriors that had made it past the outer defenses discovered that had repurposed the station's gravity generators. Corridors that looked normal suddenly shifted orientation, sending 12-foot-tall warriors tumbling helplessly through three-dimensional mazes where up and down became meaningless concepts. The second boarding party found themselves trapped in sections where had redirected the station's life support systems. Atmospheric pressure fluctuations and temperature variations created environments that their advanced armor couldn't compensate for fast enough. The third group learned why humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy for being unpredictably dangerous when cornered. Had turned the research station's particle accelerator into the galaxy's most overpowered improvised weapon system. "Station to Coalition fleet," transmitted, his voice now showing clear signs of exhaustion. "I've got maybe 45 minutes before containment failure. The exotic matter reaction is building toward critical mass. When it goes, it'll create a localized space-time implosion that should take out everything within a 50,000-kilometer radius." "Chief, that includes your position." "Yes, sir, I'm aware of that. But it also includes the entire staging fleet. They've been using this system as a launching point for attacks deeper into Coalition territory. Eliminate them here, and we buy the outer colonies at least 6 months to prepare better defenses." Admiral found himself in an impossible position. Military protocol demanded the preservation of Coalition personnel, but strategic reality suggested that sacrifice could save millions of lives in the outer territories. "There must be another way. Can you reach an escape pod?" "Negative, Admiral. Someone needs to manually control the containment field collapse to ensure maximum effectiveness. If I just let it fail naturally, they might escape the worst of the implosion effect." On the tactical display, the fleet was becoming increasingly desperate. Their ships were trapped in the gravitational distortion, unable to escape, but also unable to mount an effective final assault. They were beginning to realize that they had been lured into an elaborate trap by a single human who had turned a research station into a strategic weapon. "Admiral's voice came through the static one more time. "I need you to record something for Coalition Command. Tell them that Human Defense Corps held the line at station. And tell them that when humans say they'll defend something, they mean it. The transmission ended, leaving Admiral staring at a tactical situation unlike anything he had encountered in 30 years of military service. A single human was about to eliminate an entire enemy fleet through sheer determination and scientific improvisation. "All ships retreat to minimum safe distance," he ordered quietly, "and prepare to witness something that will be talked about in military academies for the next 1,000 years." The Coalition fleet retreated to what their computers calculated as minimum safe distance, but Admiral couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about this situation could be predicted by standard calculations. Had already accomplished the impossible several times over. Who could say what would happen when he finally triggered his exotic matter weapon? Inside station, moved through the research facility's main laboratory, past equipment that had been transformed from peaceful scientific instruments into the components of the most devastating weapon the galaxy had ever seen. The exotic matter containment field hummed with barely controlled energy, its readings climbing steadily toward the critical threshold. He had 37 minutes left. The fleet was still trapped in the gravitational distortion field he had created, their massive ships struggling against forces that made conventional navigation impossible. But they weren't giving up. Even as their vessels were twisted and compressed by the space-time anomalies, they continued firing at the station, their weapons creating spectacular light shows that accomplished little more than draining their own power reserves. Check the containment field readings one more time. The exotic matter was approaching the point where it would spontaneously collapse into what the research team had theoretically described as a localized dimensional implosion. The mathematics were beyond his understanding, but the practical result was simple enough. Everything within a vast radius would be crushed out of existence as space itself folded inward. "Final log entry, station," he spoke into the station's recording system. "I want it on record that they gave me every opportunity to surrender. They broadcast demands in 17 different languages, offered prisoner exchange protocols, and even suggested negotiated withdrawal terms. They really tried to be reasonable about this invasion thing." Another impact shook the station and grabbed a support beam to steady himself. "Unfortunately for them, humans aren't particularly reasonable when someone threatens our friends, and the people in the outer colonies are definitely our friends." He made his way to the central control console, where displays showed the exotic matter containment approaching critical levels. 28 minutes remaining. Around him, the station groaned under the stress of weapons impacts and gravitational distortions. On the Coalition fleet, Admiral was reviewing everything they knew about human military psychology. The species had joined the Galactic Defense Coalition only 50 years ago, and their reputation was still being established. They were known for being adaptable, creative, and surprisingly effective in desperate situations. But what was doing went beyond anything in the official reports. "Admiral," Commander reported, "we're receiving communications from the fleet. They're requesting immediate ceasefire and negotiation terms. After 3 days of siege warfare, they want to negotiate. It appears they've realized the nature of the trap they're in. Their fleet commanders are intelligent enough to recognize that their current position is untenable. Considered this development, can we contact Chief?" The communications officer shook her head. "Negative, sir. The exotic matter field is interfering with all transmissions to the station. He's operating in complete isolation now." Inside station was very much aware that he was alone. The station's automated systems were failing one by one as the exotic matter field grew stronger. Emergency lighting flickered and died, leaving him working by the glow of the containment field itself, which had taken on an ominous purple radiance that seemed to bend light around its edges. 18 minutes remaining. He thought about the evacuation order that had come 3 days ago. The Coalition had classified station as indefensible and ordered all personnel to withdraw immediately. Everyone else had followed orders. The scientists, the administrators, the maintenance crews, they had all left within hours of receiving the evacuation notice. Everyone except someone had needed to stay behind to prevent the exotic matter research from falling into hands. The energy contained in those experiments could have powered their war fleets for decades or been turned into weapons that could crack planets. But that hadn't been the only reason for staying. The truth was simpler and more human than tactical necessity. The outer colonies were populated largely by refugees, families who had fled conflicts in other parts of the galaxy and were trying to build new lives on frontier worlds. They were farmers, teachers, engineers, and artists who just wanted to live in peace. They represented everything that threatened that peaceful existence. Couldn't allow that threat to continue. 12 minutes remaining. The gravitational distortions around the station were becoming visible to the naked eye now. Space itself was bending, creating strange optical effects that made the ships appear to stretch and compress like images reflected in funhouse mirrors. Some of the smaller vessels were already being pulled apart by tidal forces. The fleet commanders were broadcasting increasingly desperate surrender offers. They promised withdrawal from all coalition territories, prisoner releases, and even reparation payments. But their messages couldn't reach the station through the exotic matter interference. Even if they could have reached, it wouldn't have mattered. He had made his decision 3 days ago when he chose to stay behind. Some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for. The children in the outer colonies who could grow up without fear of invasion. The families who could build homes without wondering when the next war fleet would arrive. The simple right of peaceful people to live their lives without being crushed by those who believed strength gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. 8 minutes remaining. Ran final diagnostics on the containment field. Everything was proceeding exactly as the research team's theoretical models had predicted. When the exotic matter reached critical mass, it would create a cascade collapse that would turn a 50,000-kilometer sphere of space into something that hadn't existed since the early moments after the universe began. He opened one last communication channel, broadcasting on all frequencies with the hope that someone might receive his message. This is Security Chief, Human Defense Corps, final transmission from station. To anyone receiving this, humans keep their promises. We said we would defend the innocent, and we meant it. Out. 5 minutes remaining. Sat back in the control chair and watched the containment field readings climb toward the point of no return. Outside, the fleet was trapped in a gravitational nightmare of their own making, caught between the desire to escape and the inability to leave their prey unconquered. Soon, none of that would matter. 3 minutes remaining. Watch the containment field readings reach levels that the research equipment wasn't designed to measure. The exotic matter had moved beyond all theoretical parameters and was creating effects that science hadn't predicted. The station itself was beginning to phase in and out of normal space-time, creating a surreal environment where could see through walls and floors to the void beyond. On the Coalition fleet, every sensor was focused on station. Admiral had ordered all ships to maximum retreat distance, but even 60,000 kilometers away, they could feel the gravitational effects of whatever had created. The space around the station was visibly distorting, creating ripples in reality itself. Admiral, we're detecting massive energy buildup, reported the science officer. The exotic matter reaction is approaching a threshold we've never seen before. This won't just destroy the fleet, it's going to create a permanent gravitational anomaly in this system. A permanent anomaly isn't just eliminating the enemy fleet, sir. He's changing the fundamental structure of local space-time. This system will be uninhabitable for centuries, maybe longer. Stared at the tactical display showing the trapped ships. 137 vessels, each carrying thousands of warriors, all about to be erased from existence by a single human who had refused to abandon his post. 2 minutes remaining. Inside the station, could feel the effects of the approaching collapse in his bones. Gravity was becoming inconsistent, pulling him in different directions as space-time fluctuations created pockets where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. The air itself seemed to shimmer with potential energy. He thought about his on Earth, a small farming community where nothing exciting ever happened. His parents had worried when he joined the Defense Corps, afraid that he was looking for adventure in dangerous places. They couldn't understand why he wanted to leave the safety of Earth for the uncertainty of frontier defense. Had tried to explain it to them, but words weren't adequate. Some people felt called to protect others, even when those others were strangers living on worlds they might never visit. The outer colonies represented hope, the possibility that civilization could expand without repeating the mistakes of the past. That was worth protecting. 90 seconds remaining. The fleet was beginning to disintegrate. The smaller ships were being pulled apart by gravitational shears, their hulls stretched beyond the breaking point. The larger vessels were holding together, but their crews were undoubtedly experiencing forces that their bodies weren't designed to withstand. Felt a moment of sympathy for them. They weren't evil, just aggressive. Their species had evolved in an environment where conquest was necessary for survival, and they had carried that instinct with them to the stars. Under different circumstances, they might have been allies instead of enemies. But circumstances were what they were. They had chosen to threaten peaceful colonies and had chosen to stop them. The mathematics of the situation were simple, even if the physics involved were incomprehensible. 1 minute remaining. The station's structure was becoming increasingly unstable as reality itself warped around the exotic matter containment. Could see through the walls now, watching as sections of the facility existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The effect was beautiful and terrifying, like seeing the universe from an impossible perspective. He activated the station's final automated system, a message beacon that would broadcast the story of what had happened here to any coalition ships that might pass through the system in the future. The beacon was designed to survive the dimensional collapse, serving as a permanent record of the last stand at station. 30 seconds remaining. Closed his eyes and thought about the children in the outer colonies who would grow up safely because of what happened here. They would never know his name or understand the sacrifice that had been made for their future. That was as it should be. Heroes weren't supposed to be remembered, they were supposed to be unnecessary. The exotic matter containment field reached critical mass. For a moment, everything stopped. The station, the fleet, space itself, everything existed in perfect stillness as the universe paused to consider what was about to happen. Opened his eyes and saw reality crystallized in that instant, beautiful and fragile, and worth every sacrifice that had been made to preserve it. Then the collapse began. Space-time folded inward like origami being crushed by an invisible hand. The exotic matter didn't explode, it imploded, taking everything within its influence along for the journey into dimensional nothingness. The station vanished first, compressed into a point smaller than an atom before disappearing entirely. The ships followed, their massive hulls crumpled like paper toys before being erased from existence. The implosion created a gravitational wave that rippled outward at the speed of light, carrying news of the collapse to every corner of the galaxy. When it reached the coalition fleet, their ships were thrown backward despite their distance from the epicenter, hull plates groaning under stresses they weren't designed to handle. When the wave passed and the sensors cleared, Admiral found himself staring at empty space. Where station and the fleet had been, there was now only a dark sphere of twisted spacetime, a permanent scar in reality that would serve as a monument to what had happened here. "Sensor report," said quietly. "Complete destruction of all targets, sir. No survivors detected. The gravitational anomaly appears stable, but will make this system uninhabitable for the foreseeable future." Nodded slowly. In 30 years of military service, he had never witnessed anything like what had accomplished. A single human had eliminated an entire enemy fleet through determination, creativity, and willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. Communications, send a message to Coalition Command. Inform them that Security Chief successfully defended station against overwhelming odds. Mark this system as a memorial site. As the Coalition fleet prepared to depart, Admiral took one last look at the gravitational anomaly that marked its final battle. The dark sphere would remain here long after everyone who remembered this day was gone, a permanent reminder that sometimes one person really could change the course of history. The outer colonies were safe. The invasion had been stopped. And somewhere in the quantum foam that remained of station, the echo of a human promise kept would resonate through space and time. 6 months after the Battle of Station, the story had spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. Every species in the Galactic Defense Coalition had heard some version of what had happened. A single human had held off an entire invasion fleet and destroyed it through sheer determination and scientific improvisation. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core facts remained unchanged. Admiral found himself testifying before the Coalition Council on Prime, standing before representatives of 47 different species as he recounted the events he had witnessed. The council chamber was packed beyond capacity, with delegates, military officers, and journalists from across known space hanging on every word. The human security chief had no support, no backup plan, and no hope of personal survival, explained to the assembled council. Yet he maintained his position for 3 standard days against odds that our tactical computers classified as impossible to overcome. Council Speaker Moore, an ancient being whose species had founded the coalition 2 centuries ago, leaned forward in her crystalline chair. Admiral, you witnessed the destruction of 137 warships. In your professional military opinion, how was this possible? Honorable Speaker, I believe it was possible because Chief represented something they had never encountered before, a being who valued the lives of others more than his own survival. Their entire military philosophy is based on conquest through superior force. They simply could not comprehend an enemy who would sacrifice himself to protect people he had never met. The chamber fell silent as delegates contemplated this explanation. Finally, the representative spoke up. Admiral, we have reviewed the sensor logs from your fleet. The gravitational anomaly created by Chief's weapon still exists at the coordinates. Our scientists estimate it will persist for at least 10,000 years. In effect, he has created a permanent memorial to this battle. That is correct, Representative. The anomaly has been designated as a protected memorial site by coalition decree. Ships passing through that region report unusual readings that appear to be echoes of the original exotic matter reaction. What Admiral didn't mention in his official testimony was something far more remarkable that had been discovered in the months following the battle. The gravitational anomaly wasn't just a scar in space-time. It was actively defensive. 3 separate pirate fleets had attempted to use the system as a hiding place, believing the anomaly would mask their presence from coalition patrols. All 3 fleets had been found drifting powerless at the edge of the system, their crews unconscious but unharmed, their weapons systems completely drained of power. Investigation teams sent to study these incidents found no explanation for what had happened. The ships hadn't been attacked, and there was no evidence of exotic matter exposure. They had simply been rendered harmless and pushed away from the memorial site by forces that science couldn't identify or explain. The implications were staggering, but they remained classified at the highest levels of coalition command. Somehow, his final act had created more than just a weapon. It had created a guardian that continued to protect the space where he had made his stand. In the outer colonies, the effects of the Battle of Station were more immediately apparent. The invasion force had been completely eliminated, and their government had sued for peace within weeks of learning about the disaster. The threat that had loomed over the frontier worlds for years was gone, replaced by a security that allowed families to plan for the future without fear. Children born in the months after the battle were often named, or regardless of their species. Schools throughout the outer territories taught courses on the stand, using it as an example of how individual courage could change the course of history. The story became a cultural touchstone, passed down through generations as proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. But perhaps the most significant change was in how other species viewed humanity. Before Station, humans had been seen as newcomers to galactic civilization, adaptable and creative, but lacking the military traditions of older species. After Sacrifice, that perception shifted dramatically. Military academies throughout coalition space began studying human tactical doctrines, particularly their approach to asymmetric warfare and improvised defense strategies. Human officers found themselves in high demand as advisors and strategists, their species' reputation for creative problem-solving and stubborn determination making them valuable assets in any conflict. The government formally apologized to the coalition and specifically to humanity for the invasion. In an unprecedented gesture, they erected a monument to On there, acknowledging him as an enemy who had earned their deepest respect. The inscription, translated into every known language, read simply, "To the human who kept his promise." Admiral concluded his testimony to the Coalition Council with words that would be quoted throughout the galaxy for generations to come. Chief proved that the strength of a civilization is not measured in the size of its fleets or the power of its weapons, but in the willingness of its people to sacrifice for others. He showed us that a single individual, fighting for the right cause, can accomplish what entire armies cannot. As the council session ended and delegates filed out to report the story to their respective worlds, the legend of Station continued to grow. Had become more than a hero, He had become a symbol of what sapient beings could achieve when they chose to stand for something greater than themselves. The dark sphere that marked his final battle continued to drift through space, a permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest light can drive back the greatest darkness. And in that darkness, something that might have been an echo of a human promise continued to keep watch, ensuring that the sacrifice made there would never be forgotten or made in vain. The Galactic Defense Coalition's emergency beacon pierced through the static-filled communications array aboard the starship Resilience. Admiral's four eyes narrowed as the distress signal translated across his holographic display. The message was simple, desperate, and impossible. Single human operative requests immediate evacuation. Position, station outer rim. Status, holding defensive line against assault fleet. Request acknowledged. Assistance en route. Chitinous fingers clicked against his command console in disbelief. The station had been abandoned 3 cycles ago when intelligence reported an incoming war fleet. The entire system had been evacuated. No one should have been there, especially not a single human fighting an entire enemy armada. They were not ordinary raiders. They were a species bred for conquest, standing nearly 12 feet tall with natural armor plating and weapons that could tear through standard coalition defenses like tissue paper. Their war fleets consisted of hundreds of ships, each carrying thousands of warriors. The idea that one person, regardless of species, could hold them back was beyond comprehension. "Navigation, set course for station immediately," commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen 3 decades of interstellar warfare. His tactical officer, a serpentine named, raised her head from her console. "Admiral, with respect, the system is now behind enemy lines. Intelligence suggests they have established a staging ground there. We would be flying directly into hostile territory." "One does not abandon coalition personnel, regardless of the tactical situation," replied firmly. "Besides, I am curious to see what manner of human can single-handedly delay an invasion force." The Resilience and her escort fleet of 12 ships jumped to hyperspace, racing toward what should have been certain doom. During the journey, reviewed the files on station. It had been a minor research outpost studying exotic matter, staffed by a small team of scientists and a single security officer. The security roster showed only one name: Human Defense Corps, assigned as Station Protection Specialist. As they emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, the fleet's sensors immediately detected the impossible. Station still stood, its lights blazing defiantly in the darkness of space. Around it, debris fields stretched for thousands of kilometers, the twisted remains of warships, their hulls cracked open like broken eggs. "Sensor report," demanded. "Sir, we're detecting massive damage to the fleet. At least 40 destroyed vessels, with many more showing critical damage. The station appears to be operating at minimal power but is structurally intact. We're receiving a transmission." The main screen flickered to life, revealing a human face streaked with soot and fatigue. Looked like he had been awake for days, his military uniform torn and stained. Behind him, sparks flew from damaged control panels, and the distant sound of weapons fire echoed through the station's corridors. "Admiral, this is Station Security Chief. Glad to see you made it. Things have been a bit hectic here lately." His voice carried a calmness that seemed completely at odds with the chaos visible behind him. "Chief, what is your situation? Our sensors show extensive damage to the fleet. How is this possible?" Managed a tired grin. "Well, sir, it turns out the research team here was working on some pretty interesting defensive applications of exotic matter manipulation. When the evacuation order came, someone had to stay behind to maintain the containment fields. Couldn't risk all that experimental energy falling into enemy hands." Another explosion shook the station and glanced over his shoulder. "Unfortunately, the don't seem to understand the concept of strategic withdrawal. They keep sending boarding parties, and I keep having to explain why that's a bad idea." Stared at the transmission in amazement. "You have been fighting a siege for 3 cycles, alone." "Not entirely alone, Admiral. The station's automated defense systems are quite sophisticated once you know how to reprogram them. Plus, they have a tendency to underestimate human creativity when it comes to improvised weaponry." As if to emphasize his point, another section of his uniform was singed by a nearby electrical discharge. "Chief, prepare for immediate evacuation. We will provide cover while you—" "With respect, Admiral, negative on the evacuation." I've got about 6 more hours before the exotic matter containment reaches critical mass. If I can hold the line until then, we can take out the entire staging fleet in one shot. They've been kind enough to cluster their remaining ships for a final assault. The transmission cut to static as another massive impact shook station, leaving the Coalition fleet staring at empty space and wondering how a single human had turned an impossible situation into an opportunity for victory.